Welcome to Bad Takes. I'm Laura McGann, the executive editor of Grid, and I'm here with my co-host, Matthew Iglesias. Hey, Matt, how's it going?
Hey, what's happening? It's good.
Hey, what's our bad take this week?
Okay, so this one, I want to, acknowledge we're not going after like the most important person in the universe, but one Rad Chi or Gryphonier on Twitter put forward a conspiracy theory in which he says that the showrunner of Velma, Mindy Kaling, is both a transphobe and said you couldn't make The Office today because of cancel culture. She's a fellow reactionary. She deliberately made Velma suck so the culture war YouTubers make 1 million videos about it to boost its SEO.
I love this take. I love it.
I want to talk about it not because like this take is wrecking America, but it's such a rich text. So basically, Mindy Kaling, well-known comedian, actress, writer. She has a new show on HBO Max called Velma that is sort of a revision. It's a Scooby-Doo prequel, but it's a revisionist take on Scooby-Doo. It also, the reviews of it are bad. The mainstream reviews are bad. The audience reviews are bad. And a lot of sort of conservative culture channels have not only said it's bad, but one characterized it as woke trash. They have, injected some diversity, I guess, into the show. And so Gryphonier is outlining a conspiracy theory whereby Mindy Kaling is a closet Hollywood right-winger who deliberately made Velma bad in order that other people could dunk on it. So I think that's just not true. It doesn't reach sort of surface level plausibility.
I think we should start there and say Mindy Kaling, in her career, has produced some quite successful television shows. And by all appearances, the way that she was successful is in creating shows that she seemed to think people would enjoy, from The Office to the Mindy Show, the Mindy Project, which I enjoyed personally. She's got some new show on Netflix that I have missed. It seems like more for the youngs. So I think it's fair to say that Mindy Kaling thought this animated show about Scooby-Doo, the prequel to Scooby-Doo, would be a show people would like. And, sometimes we take a swing and we miss. And that may be what happened here.
Well, right. And, it's supposed to be a humorous cartoon for adults airing on a streaming. It's an unusual project.
Yeah, it seems like it's one of those shows where I think Mindy Kaling she's probably about our age. She's an elder millennial is my sense, and that she is hearkening back to our youth, our Scooby-Doo youth, and which has become a kind of genre of taking something that was big in 20 years ago or something and sort of modernizing it. Hello, Sweet Valley High books. It's sort of like that to me. So I have not seen the show, but it just seems, it appears to be a cartoon show that tries to make something that maybe watched as kids and make it appeal to adults. And it's supposed to be funny. I don't know. I can't tell exactly. Velma appears to be a person of color in this cartoon, and the voice, Mindy Kaling, is the voice of Velma. And Velma's like the smart, nerdy one who got no credit in the original Scooby-Doo series, even though she was the brains behind the operation. I think everyone gets the gist, right, of what the show is. From just a baseline, this was supposed to be a show that, millennials approaching middle-aged, good Lord, here we are, might enjoy. And I just don't think, as much as I enjoy this double backflip take and this kind of conspiratorial take, I got a big kick out of it. I think Mindy Kaling made a show that she thought people might watch, and it turns out it's not such a hit.
Well, see, it's not unusual for comedy shows to take a few episodes to sort of hit their stride. I like the Mindy Project. I did not like the first 2 episodes of the Mindy Project, which, as is often the case for sitcoms, there's a lot of like work into explaining who the characters are and not quite as many jokes. So, we'll see. What I think is interesting about this take, right, that is sort of makes it a rich text, is not the claim that Mindy Kaling deliberately tanked her own show, which is ridiculous, but the claim that Mindy Kaling is a secret fellow reactionary. Right now, I don't know Mindy Kaling. I never talked politics with her, but like many people, she has on occasion explicitly addressed a political question. So, for example, when Joe Biden announced that his running mate was going to be Kamala Harris, Kaling tweeted, "Was there ever more of an exciting day? For our entire country, of course, but especially for my Black and Indian sisters. Many of us who've gone our entire lives thinking that someone who looks like us may never hold high office. We work so hard and contribute to the fabric of our lives in America. And now to see Kamala Harris rise to the top like this, it's thrilling."
Oh yeah, I mean, so I follow Kaling on the Instagram. She had her on. They did a cooking show together with Indian spices and made their mothers all like everybody keeps their spices in the same metal Folgers cans. I mean, she went hard for this Indian woman.
I'd considered doing a gas stoves episode, and I remember. I mean, I saw Mindy Kaling and Kamala Harris on camera with their gas stove making doses.
Sure.
I think at least Mindy Kaling is her overt politics seem like she's a pretty normal Democrat who likes Joe Biden, who is excited to see an Indian American woman on the ticket, like herself, who, not just was excited though, but like went the extra mile to like try to get her fans hyped up about the Biden Harris ticket. And there's something I think very real though about there's something like fake and dumb about the idea that people are deliberately tanking their own show, but there's something that I think is in the air of accusing people whose stated politics are that they are kind of banal center left Joe Biden supporting Democrats of being closet reactionaries, right? And I think the evidence for that claim is itself interesting. As far as I can tell, there are two pieces to it. One is that Kaling once liked a J.K. Rowling tweet. And the other is this thing that Kaling said, where she said that she didn't think you could make The Office today because of people's, sensitivities around political correctness or cancel culture or whatever it is you want to say it. And I think that it is true that, Kaling is, I think like a lot of comedians are, somewhat critical of this kind of really specific, like narrow trend in politics toward people getting less forgiving of the idea that you're joking around or doing something for the lulz. Now, if you want to say a Joe Biden supporter and vocal Kamala Harris ally who celebrated Donald Trump being booted from office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is a reactionary because she has some remorse over less jokes on television. I mean, that's interesting, right? I mean, that to me is an interesting way of looking at politics. And it's interesting to me that this happened back in December. Kaling, I think she was on a press tour for Velma. And so, but people were asking her about other stuff she'd been involved with. The Office, she was not as central to The Office as she was to Velma or to the Mindy Project, but it's probably the biggest thing she's ever been in, the most popular thing. And, she made these somewhat ambiguous remarks about The Office and cancel culture. And it then became this thing, there's a BuzzFeed article about how she faced a backlash over this, and a few different pieces like this. And it's one of these things where like it's not clear to me like how big of a backlash was this. I think most people read that interview and was like, yeah, she's right. Like the times have changed. You couldn't put a show like that on anymore.
Sure. Okay, let's back up because number one, I think we should just address it. I don't think it's that central to the conversation personally. I think we want to have, but the J.K. Rowling tweet was this tweet where J.K. Rowling says she's been upset about the haters, but then she opens her royalty checks and suddenly, that feeling fades.
Somebody asked her, like, how do you like go on knowing how many fans you've lost? And she was like, I open my royalty checks and I feel like it's fine. And so Kaling gave a little heart to that.
I mean, yeah. So who knows? Like, I think that Kaling, it was like tip of the hat to somebody who made a joke is one way to look at that. Another way to look at it is that Kaling likes J.K. Rowling's views on transgender rights and being a sort of ardent supporter of the TERF movement. I tend to think Kaling, as a comedian, is like, hats off, tip of the hat. That's a funny quip. Who is to say? But anyway, that is evidence number one, because the transphobe accusation was, that's a pretty big claim. As far as I understand, it's this tweet. So setting that aside, it does speak to the issue. But setting that aside, number two of this, could you make the office today? I thought what was interesting, I think it was the BuzzFeed article that I read, was the counterpoint to that is it's one of the most popular streaming shows ever. In recent years, people are watching it in mass. So it's not like, it aired again and people went, whoa, I hate this show. It seems more like there are bits of the show where you think that didn't age the best. I personally had never really seen The Office when it aired, mainly because I was in my early 20s and didn't have money. And so I didn't have a TV and I just could have missed it. And during the pandemic, I watched a huge chunk of The Office and I got a kick out of it. So I got into watching it. And my feeling about the show was it was a funny, somewhat dark satire about American office life. I actually thought it became less dark over the seasons and they made Steve Carell, who was the boss in the office, a little bit more of a lovable figure. But I felt the early episodes were pretty cutting. That it's the I don't know. I think everyone else has seen The Office, everybody but me. But the idea was there were these, it was almost like someone was doing a documentary of American life in an office.
If you've never seen The Office, you just got to press pause, watch about 200 hours of television, and then come back.
But I think the reason I'm laying this out is that the premise of the show is, it's a documentary. It was a mockumentary, right? It was a sort of satirical thing where you're watching these characters, act out American life in these extreme ways that are funny because they have that grain of truth, and it's dark. It's funny because it's true, but it's dark. Anyway, the show was not celebrating the fact that Steve Carell kind of sexually harassed people, used to say racist things about his employees. Like, it wasn't a celebration of those things. It had this dark undertone. And so it was uncomfortable. It was funny because it was uncomfortable. So I think that there are two things going on. One, I think that sometimes when there are criticisms of past shows, it's sort of missing, and even current shows, sort of missing the point that the show is not meant to celebrate these things. It's funny because it's not funny. And then there's this other question that we're trying to get at here of Kaling saying you couldn't make it today because some of the stuff just went too far. And I'm a little bit, I went back and read what she said about it, and it's a little unclear to me how she feels about this. It seems like she kind of laments it in some ways, but in other ways she's like, yeah, that's it. We did go too far a few times. So for the modern day. So it didn't sound like she, to me, had this really hardline take about this is terrible, that Americans are too touchy. But she does seem to lament it a little bit. I mean, like you said, she's a comedian, and having more space to work with and come up with jokes when your job is to come up with lots of jokes, you want to have more to work with than less. That's my overall impression of how she sees this.
I think it's interesting, right? Because so she said this thing, and a lot of the backlash, right? When I saw the backlash aggregation, consisted of people pointing out that The Office has hardly been canceled, quote unquote. Like it's available on streaming, it's sold for a huge amount of money, it was incredibly popular on Netflix for years and years and years. Its presence on Peacock is which is like a second tier streaming service, but like that's the best thing that Peacock has. It's their number one sort of driver of audience. uh, I was interested, after having read that that was in the backlash, to then go back and look at what Kaling had actually said, because she specifically says that the reason she thinks it's so popular is that they wouldn't make something like that today. Right? So, like, her claim is that the audience continues to have an appetite for this kind of content, but that it is not being made because sort of tastes and pressures in the industry have shifted. And, so in a certain sense, right, it's like everybody is agreeing on some level. Um, but I also think that another level, like, people disagree about the value of comedy in a way that is, kind of interesting. Like I've witnessed as a journalist now a number of controversies about Dave Chappelle, about Elon Musk, about the Babylon Bee, right? And it keeps recurring, in which comedians think that it is very important to have free reign to make jokes that may be offensive, right? And they, I think, rightly believe that this is important to the practice of comedy, that like comedy is more funny when the comedian doesn't need to worry about getting in trouble. What's like not really clear to me, as somebody who is not himself a comedian, or like a huge fan of stand-up comedy, is like, how important is that? As a thing. Like a friend of mine took me recently to a Chris Rock show that's going on tour, and that I think when he does his Netflix special that is based off this show, I think there's going to be a lot of controversy about this Chris Rock special, because he is deliberately being provocative. He's deliberately playing with fire. Uh, I was in the audience for the show. I thought it was quite funny. It's a Washington, D.C. audience. There's a majority of liberal people. The audience, I would say, was about 50-50 black and white. Everybody thought it was funny. When it comes out, I think there's going to be some pressure to cancel him. There's going to be counter takes that you shouldn't cancel him. And my take is going to be that, like, everybody is correct about this. Like, it was a genuinely funny set of jokes on a touchy subject, that there would be less laughter if he wasn't allowed to make these jokes. But at the same time, like, he is reinscribing, like, broad stereotypes in a way that is not fully accurate, in a way that in some level could be construed as harmful or offensive. And, it's like my friend who I went to the show with loves stand-up comedy. I like stand-up comedy. If this kind of comedy went away, he would be very disappointed, because he's a huge stand-up comedy fan. I would say, I don't know, I had a good time, but I could take it or leave it. And that's like kind of how I feel about this.
So in terms of just that, in terms of talking about when we talk about comedy and stand-up comedy, I have trouble disentangling myself from, do I not like stand-up comedy, or do I just not like most stand-up comics? Because they just seem like kind of gross dudes who say stuff that occasionally I'm like, that's funny. It's just not for me. Just not my taste. A lot of the jokes, I'm like, that's just not funny to me. I'm not sitting there like I'm so offended. I just sit there and I'm like, well, I'm not laughing because I just don't find that funny. And that's just my taste. And I don't know. It's just my taste. I don't care for it. But also, I have never seen anything that makes me want to. I mean, I guess I never signed petitions for anything. But if I did, this would not be it. I mean, I don't care for a lot of stand-up comedy. And, I don't know if it's because it's offensive. Some stuff I have been truly, offended by some jokes that I've heard, where it's like, you're trying to make a joke. It's sort of, speaking to, like, it's almost empowering nasty beliefs. Like, what, I forget what comedian was it, Chris Rock, now I don't even know, but it was this thing where some comedian during Me Too made this joke of, your boss is calling you masturbating on the phone, why don't you just hang up the phone? And everyone's laughing. And to me, the way the joke was delivered is he kind of meant it. He's like, what are these, it just sort of validated, was not edgy to me because it was validating a long time held belief, and it just didn't strike me as that funny. I was like, I kind of want to hang up the phone on you because you're not that funny to me. But that's one joke. Is it the end of the world? No, it's a joke, and I didn't like it. I did not care for it, and I moved on with my life. And so I don't know. I don't want to use stand-up comedy to represent all of comedy in culture, because we've got, like you said, for example, we have The Office. Did you want to talk about, what are some of the spicier episodes? I mean, the thing is, I would not say that The Office was that spicy of a show. And it all kind of blurs together. It's not like part of the point of the show is just sort of documenting the mundane existence of working in an office. It's not like there was one episode where it was like, and then the aliens invaded in that one episode. That was some plot twist. There's not a lot of plot twists going on. I mean, it was just a funny show. I think some of the cancellation though would be, they did these on and off. There'd be episodes where there was one where they did sensitivity training around race, and that, you can imagine that it was just a bunch of stereotypes. I think they each had to pretend to be a certain race and get together, and so then they're acting out stereotypes. I mean, it's very cringy. It was very bad. But at the same time, we do know that some of these harassment trainings are really bad. They actually lead to outcomes that are the opposite of what you want. So watching it was kind of funny to me to see like this thing going off the rails in a much more explicit way than you would normally see in these kinds of trainings. But I found it funny just because you and I have talked about this over the years, that the evidence is not really there to support the idea that doing these types of sensitivity trainings actually improve the workforce as intent, or workplace as intended. And in fact, there's some evidence that it does the opposite. So I found that episode funny because it was hitting on that. It wasn't funny because racist stereotypes are funny.
I think this is the nuance, right? So you look at like probably the two most sort of politically explicit episodes of the show, right, are Diversity Day and Sexual Harassment, which are both, because the show is satirizing office culture. So these are both episodes that satirize exercises that we're familiar with. The sexual harassment episode, BJ Novak wrote specifically after doing a sexual harassment training, that NBC did. And anyone who's ever worked in a corporate environment has, I'm sure, had one of these like sexual harassment training video things. And they're kind of comical, right? And the point of the joke is not to say that sexual harassment is funny. Or that it isn't a serious problem, but it's to say that these corporate sexual harassment trainings are kind of ineffectual and lame, right? And that's the point. If I were to like distill that episode down to a thesis, the thesis of the article is that like corporate HR departments' sexual harassment training efforts are not efficacious. And the same with the Diversity Day thing, right? Like the point of the Diversity Day episode is that Steve Carell does not face genuine consequences for his racial microaggressions, that corporate sort of puts everybody through a lot of hoopla, but the hoopla has no real impact or force. That being said, what actually occurs in both of those episodes, it's not a dramatic series, right, depicting this inefficacy. It's a comedy series. So a lot of the part of the joke in the sexual harassment episode is that characters make jokes in the fiction that constitute a hostile workplace violations, right? Part of the joke in the Diversity Day episode is that Steve Carell's character keeps saying racist stuff. And you are meant to, if you not if you agree with BJ Novak's thesis as the author of those episodes, but as a fan, if you laugh at the jokes, like what you are doing is laughing at sexist and racist, sexually crude or racially stereotyping jokes, right? And you, as the audience, this is what always makes comedy complicated. You are both laughing at the joke and you're laughing at the idea of the joke, right? It's meta. And one question, this was something Chappelle in an earlier phase in his career wrestled with, right? He would said, he was concerned that people were laughing at his jokes for the wrong reasons.
Yeah, I mean, he went dark for a while after the Chappelle show. I mean, it was his wild success, the Chappelle show. I mean, it was a brilliant show in my opinion, as somebody who's yeah, I'm not a comedy connoisseur. I think we've covered that ground, but I remember the show. It was very funny as a really I think Chappelle put himself out there in the show. I mean, I remember you can remember the episode where he's sitting on a porch with a bunch of white supremacists and he's blind and he doesn't know he's black. And so the white supremacists are like, oh, we just feel bad for the guy. He thinks he's white, so we let him in. And it's just so funny on just this. There's the basic level, right? Like, okay, this guy doesn't know he's black, and that's kind of, it's just like an absurdity and funny. And then two, it's a commentary on how absurd these white supremacists are. That they're just constructing a form of hate, right? Like that's why it's funny. You're laughing at the white supremacists, but he felt, as I recall, before he went dark for a period of time, he just retreated from the world. And he felt that people were laughing at the wrong jokes, that they were just surface level laughing at racist jokes, and that people felt it was okay to make racist jokes.
Going further back, right? One of my favorite episodes of Seinfeld is the one where the dentist converts to Judaism. And the accusation is that he converted to Judaism just so that he could tell anti-Semitic jokes. Which was a funny idea because that's a funny idea. It's also funny to me because, like, I'm Jewish. I grew up in New York, where the vast majority of people who I hung out with and who I knew were Jewish. We all enjoyed these Jewish jokes, like amongst ourselves as a community. Part of what happens in the episode is there's the meta joke about Tim Whatley becoming Jewish for the jokes, but he also tells the jokes, right? And so you have an audience in this case that is, the Seinfeld audience is like mostly non-Jews, and they are laughing at these Jewish jokes that in most times, that maybe in the 60s, people would just tell. But by the 90s, you can't tell a joke like that, but you can tell it with the ironic distancing provided by the show. Right. But then another layer to that is that Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, the people behind that show, are themselves Jewish. Right. So they are telling you, we have created a safe space for this humor to occur in. I'm not totally sure that applies to the sexual harassment episode, right? In which they are both lampooning the sexual harassment training, but they're also telling a certain kind of sexually crude joke that would get you in trouble at work. And it's a diverse writing staff on the team, but the lead writer for that episode is a white man, BJ Novak, who a guy like him or like me, who's 30 years older, would have just told those jokes at the office, right? But in our cohort, we won't do that because, like, we know you could get in trouble with it. But the sitcom creates a means in which you can do those jokes, right? But then as times change, and this is, I think, Kaling's point, like maybe you couldn't do that anymore, or at least you couldn't do it in that way, right? It would have to be even more complicated, but maybe too complicated. Like, I think that there are so many levels of meta-ness going on in Velma that, like, it seems like people don't like it that much because it's hard, right? Because, like,
right.
I mean, I do a very humorless, incredibly dry style of political commentary, right? If I wanted to write a piece that was like, here is an evaluation of workplace sexual harassment trainings, it just like wouldn't be very funny. It wouldn't be that enjoyable. Like I would try to make it true and correct because that's the kind of work that I do. But what comedians do is they try to do stuff that's funny. And the more pressure you put on people to like make things analytically rigorous, I think it's just harder to be funny.
Maybe it does make it harder to be funny, but so what? Like, just work harder. I'm sorry that, like, ooh, comedians are gonna have to work a little harder to be funny. And maybe if we have a culture where there's a higher bar for good jokes, maybe that's not so bad. Maybe we would have comedians breaking through who wouldn't in the past because their, lampooning wasn't seen as funny. And so it's one of these things that if you're an existing comedian who's made your career in a certain way and you're saying, I'm being limited by this cancel culture, the counter argument there is, well, maybe there's a whole other world of jokes out there that weren't getting told because we all accepted that this was what's funny. And maybe there's other funny things out there that this would give, if we kind of reject your humor, maybe there's some other humor that could break through. And, I don't know how much that, like, the weight versus counterweight there is, but, I think about the movie Bridesmaids was this really, when it came out, felt groundbreaking to me that there were these women who were very funny and the movie was funny, and it was a movie written by women and the cast was predominantly women, and a lot of the jokes really spoke to me. Like, it was a time of my life where, I was buying a lot of really expensive really expensive dresses and going to these boutiques and stuff, and it spoke to me because it was absurd, right? Like, it just, yeah, it fit my experience at the time, and it was very funny. I would never say to a friend who was getting married, like, your wedding is absurd. I mean, maybe I did say that, but in any case, I don't know how much saying, hey, your comedy isn't that funny, open the door for other people to be funny, or maybe not. But in any case, I think it's good.
To me, this is why Kaling's original take, I think, was just like kind of equivocal, right? Like I don't think she was trying to make like a huge reactionary point that like this is the worst thing ever, that standards have changed. But she is trying to, as a I'm sitting here as like a kind of humorless political columnist. So I agree with you. I don't really care if life has gotten harder for sitcom writers. Like, to me, that doesn't seem like a major cost to the universe. But of course, you can see why a professional sitcom writer would feel that it's a big deal, right? And part of why we have journalism, like the reason why it's a good idea to interview people and quote what they say, is just like you get these perspectives, right? How does a woman of color who works professionally in the field of comedy writing feel about the cultural shifts around this? And the answer is she feels a little bit ambivalent, right? Like it's like it's not the end of the world, but like it's an interesting update.
I would be interested if we had gotten a follow-up with her about the experience between writing for The Office and now writing for the Mindy Project, and then now she's producing the show Never Have I Ever. I don't know how much she's a writer on the show. I think she is. I'm not sure. Maybe she's written some episodes, but she's clearly the driving force behind this new show, and it seems to be a very popular show. So, and it's a kind of drama comedy. It's in her wheelhouse. So, what does she think of that? Like, is the show more funny because of the different cultural norms, or does she think the show would be more funny if she had more leeway with it? I don't know. I have no idea because no one asked her. I didn't ask her. Maybe we need to.
Right. I mean, but I guess like the main thing that I think about this as we come to an end is that there's something weird to me about the impulse to like sniff out the idea that people are secret reactionaries because they have some ambivalence or mixed feelings about aspects of cultural change that have occurred over the course of their lifetime. Like, I think this is just like me getting older. But like, as you get older and as you know more people who are old, you just recognize that like things change, and it is very rare to have a big, complicated social shift that is totally unequivocal in its impact. And it's just like normal for people to have a little bit of like, meh, you know, I think people like some aspects of this old show that you couldn't do today because standards have changed in the world, right? That is different from saying, I think it is bad that the world has changed, right? But I watch all the time old movies that I enjoy, and I say, you couldn't do that today, and like probably for good reason. I think like broadly speaking, culture has changed for the better over the course of my lifetime, but there was some good stuff that was made under the older norms, or aspects of it that were good, or if you approach it with a healthy mindset, it maybe wasn't quite as bad as people might think. And that's okay, right? That you have to acknowledge that, the world changes, and there's some good and some bad with that.
I think the other thing that is good is that if you look at Velma, I'm going to watch it, we'll see, is that it's an evolution of something in the past, that it's putting in the context in the present. I was struck also Gilmore Girls. I had watched some episodes in real time, when it was a popular show, but I never watched the whole series. Netflix put it out there. I watched the series over the course of like a year or something. And so I watched Gilmore Girls. And then a few years later, there was this, the original writer of the show brings us up to date of what has happened in the last, whatever it is, 20 years since the Gilmore Girls, the show ended. So we get back together and we see what's happened. And one thing that had struck me about the original show as I was watching it, as much as it really was in ways like a very progressive show, that it was this single mom raising her daughter, and her daughter had big ideas and bold ideas, and there was really great dialogue between female characters. It was good in a lot of ways, and to me personally, in terms of cultural, pushing the bounds of cultural norms in TV. However, there were a couple of scenes where the older Rory, the mom character, who's this free spirit and generally very accepting, and that's part of her role, make quips that were, to me, homophobic and anti-gay, and were actually specifically directed at one of the other characters. And in the new version, in this sort of up to date, we see that character is now out and has a partner and is part of the community, and that the mom Rory, is supportive, and he's just part of the show and the community. And so you see her evolution from a person who in the 90s, it was somehow, she was that it would be possible for a show writer to think a character like this woman who is super open and accepting would also, that it was in line for that person to also make gay jokes, and that was possible in that culture, and it made sense. And nobody said at the time, like, what the hell? Why would that would never, what is this out of character, bizarre stuff? And then now, if she were still doing it in the up to date show, it would be like, what? Like, there'd be a whole, like, we need to explore this. Like, what the heck is going on here? And she isn't. She has evolved. And so I think that there's value in that you watch the way that things were culturally acceptable in the past and bringing them up to the present. And it's useful that there were jokes on the show that were patently bad. And I think were bad. I think those jokes were contributing to a culture where people were being marginalized, dehumanized. And then over time, those types of jokes were just not okay. And to me, that's okay. I think that's good even. So that is a kind of medium take. And I think that a lot of times on this show and in our lives, you and I celebrate the medium take as the best take. So, let's hear it for the medium take. Sometimes you don't need a great take. You don't need a bad take. You don't need a hot take. You just need that medium take. And that's okay.
Okay, so we're agreeing Mindy Kaling is not a closet reactionary deliberately tanking her own HBO Max show in order to boost the SEO for right-wing YouTubers. The world is more complicated than that.
Yeah, the world, that is a complicated take, and the world is complicated, but I think we agree that the world is complicated in a totally other way.
So that said, this has been another episode of Bad Takes from Grid. We're produced by Paul Woodhell and District Productive, and we'll be back next week with more Bad Takes.